Sentinels bonus scene. Bomber's Moon. The barmaid turns off the radio, and the short period of attentive silence ends. The crowd in the bar start discussing the war news. It's a moment Rachel has experienced hundreds of times since she arrived in England, but this time it feels different. There's a sense of hope today, the kind of excitement that comes when people who've endured a brutal ordeal realize that there might finally be an end in sight. Stalingrad, gotta say, has kind of a ring to it, she says, taking a sip of her drink. But do you think we can trust Stalin? Asks Charlotte. The Red Army's giving the Nazis a hell of a beating. Stalin's a bastard, but he's on our side for now, replies Rachel. Sure, we've heard about his glorious victories before, but maybe this is it. Imagine that. Maybe historians will write that this year is the turning point. There has to be one. Why not 1943? The year Hitler's luck finally ran out. Look out, says Charlotte, suddenly distracted. God Squad at 6 o'clock. Rachel raises an eyebrow. It's not the first time she's been puzzled by her friend's quirky English. Charlotte nods towards the door, and Rachel twists round to see a white-haired man in black clothes looking around the barroom. For a moment, Rachel doesn't recognize him. Then memories flood back. She jumps up and rushes over to throw her arms around the startled priest. Reverend Black, it's so good to see you again. Thank you, Miss Rubin, replies the clergyman, smiling after his initial surprise. But I wonder if my bishop will be pleased to hear I've been hugged by an unmarried young lady in a public house. Oh, sorry. Don't want to get you in trouble with a big boss. I mean, apart from God, that is. Listen to me going on. I'm so excited. Call me Rachel, why don't you? No need to be formal. Why not get yourself a drink and come join us? My platinum blonde pal over there is Charlotte Marsh. You know, the feature writer for the London Weekly. She'd love to meet you. I told her all about Doncaster. Maybe you can confirm it so she knows I'm not crazy? Of course, replies Black, and nods to Charlotte, who gives him her best Hollywood starlet smile. I'll get whatever passes for a gin and tonic in here, and join you. Rachel rejoins Charlotte, who asks, So, planning on becoming a nun, or just debauching a man of the cloth in time-honoured tabloid fashion? That man is an old friend, Reverend Black. You remember what I told you about him? Ah, the redoubtable vicar from haunted East Anglia, says Charlotte. I will be the soul of discretion, don't you worry. He's a bit old for me, anyway. Nice eyes, though. Rachel tries to glare her friend into submission. Charlotte gives a sly grin and asks, Just on the off chance, do you happen to know if he's married? God, you're awful. The priest's arrival cuts off their banter. I was redirected here from your agency office, he explains, taking a seat. Your editor seemed a little bemused when I asked for you. He said that when you're not at your desk, you're usually in the pub. That's our girl, says Charlotte, lighting a cigarette. You came here to see me? Asks Rachel. Yes, the priest replies. Then with a glance at Charlotte, I assume we can speak freely about certain matters. You mean those Saxon ghosts that went around killing all those people? Asks Charlotte, heads turn at the next table. I see you have confided in Miss Marsh, says Black with a slight smile. You see, Rachel, my superiors in the church have contacted me about a problem that you might, conceivably, be able to help solve. I suppose it involves the paranormal in some way, she asks, careful to keep her voice low. Yes, I'm afraid so, in a rather disturbing and unpleasant way. Charlotte leans forward, staring wide-eyed at the priest. Tell us more. The priest takes a sip of his drink, then begins. This week I'm in London for a conference on the role of church schools in post-war education. Yes, we are planning for victory. Anyway, a Catholic priest, Father O'Connor, approached me and asked about Doncaster and the Sentinels. I was a little evasive at first, until he told me why he was interested. Rachel settles into the passenger seat, and Tony nods to a buff-coloured file folder on the dashboard. I called in some favours at the Defence Ministry, the least I could do for the woman who saved my life. You're a treasure, Lieutenant Beaumont, she says, giving him a peck on the cheek. Just so long as I don't get buried, he jokes, pulling away from the curb. Rachel looks through the contents of the file as Tony weaves his staff car through London's evening traffic. There's not much to it, he goes on. Happened about a month ago, just a typical hit-and-run raid that went wrong, for the enemy, that is. After we gave them a beating last year, they've been less willing to make massed attacks, but they still send out plenty of lone raiders. Rachel studies a few typewritten sheets reporting the incident, plus a photograph of a ruined building. The dark green tail section of an airplane sticks out of the wreckage, the swastika markings still visible. Heinkel 111, she says automatically. The Heinkel's tail fin is distinctive. The silhouettes of most hostile and friendly aircraft are familiar to her by now. It's one of the ways she's become a Londoner by adoption. Correct, says Tony. Of course, the front of that type is pretty much all perspex. Excellent visibility, but zero protection in a crash. Rachel looks more closely and sees what was once a man. The remains lie among the tangle of metal where the cockpit was smashed in by the impact. She can make out a leg, what might be part of an arm, and other indeterminate pieces. She puts the photo back into the folder. So it was just the one guy, the pilot, in the actual crash? Yes, he replies. The bomber was tagged over the estuary by 2 RAF night fighters and took a hit. Its engine caught fire. The pilot managed to keep flying high and level long enough for his crew to bail out. By that time it was too late for him, though. Went straight into a warehouse. Killed a night watchman. Could have been worse, but he'd already dropped his bombs. Missed the docks, as it happens. She reads the report, but there's nothing to add to the photograph. An enemy came under cover of night to attack us and was destroyed. Why should the man's spirit remain when so many have passed on in this war? What anchors him to this one piece of earth? Rachel, says Tony, putting a hand on hers for a second, do you have to do this? I know Black is a good man and you want to help him, but remember what happened in Doncaster. You've been almost free of them lately, the ghosts, and you've had no strange dreams, have you? No, she admits, patting his arm, and I don't want any, but Reverend Black does seem concerned, and his instincts were right last time. I might not be able to help, but I should try. Tony gives her a boyish smile. Well, here goes. Let's see what happens. It's almost twilight when they arrive. The East End is the part of London nearest to German air bases in occupied Europe, and home to a lot of prime targets. According to Churchill, the worst is over, but night raids are still frequent. It shows in the eyes of the people, the sleepless nights spent in shelters or deep in the stations of the London Underground Railway. By day, 1 million adults and children go about their lives half awake, moving like pale zombies through their battered neighbourhoods. My God, Rachel thinks as they climb out of the car, these people seem like refugees in their own country. A line of school children file past. Some kids are shouting and joking, but most seem preoccupied. The night is never far away for Londoners. Rachel? Black's voice brings her back to the present. The clergyman is standing at the entrance to a side street with another man in black. Tony and Rachel are introduced to Father O'Connor. He's short and plump, with a pleasant smile. I'm so glad you could come, says the Catholic priest, with a trace of Irish accent. It's a terrible thing to have to ask anyone I know. Well, I can't promise anything, but can you show me where the haunting's taking place? The priest leads the party up the side street. Just the place for lost souls, she thinks, or maybe worse. We're walking through the gaping wounds of London. She shudders at the thought of the damaged city reacting like a wounded animal, lashing out in fear and rage. She tries to shake off the thought. This is the place, says O'Connor, opening a door that bears traces of green paint. The door opens into hundreds of square feet of wreckage. 2 sides of the building are gone, the third shored up with wooden beams. I must get the number of their cleaner, says Tony, picking his way inside after the priests. Rachel brings up the rear, already feeling an ominous sense of a presence that can't be seen, or at least not yet. You didn't tell me what the nature of the haunting is, Father? She asks. The Irishman stops and turns, his face shadowed in the poor light. The workmen detailed to pull the place down said they heard screaming out of nowhere. It spooked them so badly they wouldn't finish the job. Apart from anything else, we really need what's left of this place demolished. Kids might get caught in it if it collapses. Rachel nods and walks slowly to the rough centre of the ruined building. Have other people reported noises? She asks. Yes, replies O'Connor. The locals try to keep away from here, especially around the time of night when the crash happened. That's the worst time, apparently, and it's been getting louder, more frequent lately. Rachel closes her eyes and tries to recall her encounters with the dead in Doncaster. There's no instruction manual for this, she thinks, but maybe if I just kind of open my mind, something will happen. After a few moments, she hears an odd phrase. Enemy coast ahead. She opens her eyes, looks round. "Did you say something, Tony?" "No, why?" He walks up, puts an arm round her shoulder. "I thought I heard someone say something about an enemy coast." "In German?" "No, it seemed like English, but then I was hearing it in my mind, like I did with the Sentinels. I'll try again." Eyes closed, she again hears the clipped, clear voice. "Thames estuary dead ahead. Keep alert for English aircraft. Stand by to commence our attack run." She can see the silver snake of the great river ahead and below. She's sitting in mid-air, or so it seems, the transparent cockpit of the bomber all around her. She looks down at England between her feet. The roar of the engines are almost overwhelming the intercom chatter between her crew. There's a stutter of automatic fire as the gunners test their weapons. "Rachel? Rachel, can you hear me?" A voice in a dream. Tony is far away. The reality is the enemy city below, the moonlit river that winds through its heart, giving a position better than any map. The full moon is their friend, illuminating river or lake or even railroad lines, mocking the blackout. It's a bomber's moon, a great heavenly searchlight picking out the enemies of the fatherland. "English fighter! No, two!" More gunfire, and not just from her crew. A fiery stream of cannon shells passed just under the port wing. She feels a series of jarring shocks through the airframe, and the port engine falters. Instruments show oil pressure falling. "We're on fire!" shouts the navigator. Then the voices of frightened men fill her head. Rachel opens her eyes, staring around in panic, shouting, "Get out! Get out!" She's crouching amid brick rubble, wood splinters, and fragments of plaster, with Tony trying to stop her from falling into the debris. "Cramped cockpit?" asks Reverend Black. She nods, stands up straight, and brushes off her clothes. "Smart cookie, he's ahead of me." "You were shouting something in German that time," says Tony. "Was that him?" Rachel nods. "The pilot's reliving it, over and over again," she explains. "His last few minutes when he gave up his life for his friends. Perhaps that's the key, his sacrifice." Tony is about to speak when a piercing shriek echoes around the warehouse, seemingly coming from all sides at once. It's hard to tell if it's a man's voice or if it's even human. The men cover their ears, but Rachel doesn't bother, knowing the sound isn't one you can block out physically. That was the moment of impact. That created a soul in torment, she thinks, trapped in a cycle of fear and suffering. Why? Why him and not the hundreds or thousands of other war dead? Says O'Connor, crossing himself. "I don't know, Father," she says. "Perhaps because his fear was so much greater than most? He must have known what he was doing long before the end." "When did the crash happen?" asks Black. Tony opens the folder and checks a form. "Just after 2 p.m, that's over 4 hours away," he says. "No reason why he should run to a timetable," observes O'Connor. "No, but maybe it's worse at the precise time of day," says Rachel. "And the full moon is tonight, isn't it?" The men look puzzled, but Tony nods. "I think that explains why it's been escalating," she goes on. "Somehow the bomber's moon is fixed in his mind. He saw it as his friend that night, but it led him to his death." "Are you proposing to stay here till 2 in the morning?" asks Tony. "I think I should be here at that time. It might be the way to make contact, to help him, if I can help at all." "Well, I'd be delighted if you could all join me for supper in the meantime," says O'Connor. They file out of the ruined warehouse. Nobody attempts to make conversation for a while. In the early hours of the morning, the blacked-out streets are lit by a huge harvest moon. As the party makes its way from Father O'Connor's home to the warehouse, they're stopped briefly by a police officer on the lookout for looters. He recognizes the priest's voice and waves them on. "Does he know where we're going?" asks Rachel. "He's probably guessed," says O'Connor. "It's common knowledge round here. Nobody goes near the place after dark." They're more tentative as they make their way into the warehouse this time. Colourless moonlight casts deep shadows. It's hard to be sure what you're treading on. Rachel finds the place where she stood earlier and asks Tony the time. "Just before 2, he replies. "Are you sure you want to follow him all the way down?" "I think I have to know him to help him," she says. "What other way is there?" Rachel prepares herself amid the wreckage of the warehouse. The 3 men stand around, close enough to catch her if she falls, but not too close. They don't want to crowd me, she thinks. Or is it they're afraid of what I represent? Even 2 men who believe in miracles? Rachel shakes her head, trying to dispel all thoughts of herself, closes her eyes. She's timed it right. Again she's piloting her aircraft over the Thames estuary. She hears the gunners test their weapons, the sudden warning of enemy fighters. She nurses the crippled bomber upriver, shouting at her comrades to bail out and take their chances. She keeps demanding responses until the silence convinces her the others are out, maybe safe. She loosens her oxygen mask. It's useless at this low altitude. The moonlight shows the tangle of London streets spread out below. A great city looking like a chart inked in monochrome. Rachel can make out individual houses, neatly kept gardens, even a London bus on its route. Far too low to jump for it, even if she could leave the controls. Instead, she goes straight in and as slow as possible, aiming for the silver curve of the Thames, sure until the last few seconds that she can splash down and take her chances in the water. The ground comes up fast. A big, ugly building is startlingly clear in the pallid light. Then the front of the Heinkel smashes in, and she's hammered back through her seat by the impact. The pain is incredible, and she cries out one word over and over as her body is broken. Just before the darkness engulfs her, she smells something, a pungent odour. Is the main fuel tank ruptured? Oh God, am I going to burn? Rachel. She sees Tony's face upside down, smiles up at him. The strong chemical smell is still there. O'Connor is holding a small bottle under her nose. Thanks, Father. Do you always carry smelling salts? He plugs the bottle and puts it back inside his coat. Comes in handy, the Irishman says. I get to deliver bad news to people. Sometimes they faint. Well, says Black, as he helps Tony lift Rachel to her feet, we know a little more. What was that word she was shouting? Asks O'Connor. It sounded like mutty? German for mommy, explains Rachel. He died crying for his mother, him and thousands of others in this war. Then she sees him a few yards away. He's trying to get up from a heap of rubble. He moves painfully, his limbs not bending as nature intended, and she thinks of the way a stepped-on spider can keep moving. The others look, but then they look back at Rachel. She knows they can see nothing. She wants to call to him. She can't remember the details in the file, the crew roster, and she didn't know it when she was him, joined with his spirit in the last moments of his short life. What was his name, his full name, she says, without turning. Tony says, the pilot was Michael Udet. Rachel walks towards the dark, twisted shape that's still struggling to stand. Michael? Can you hear me, Michael? Even in the dim pale light she can see that the man was wrecked as thoroughly as his plane. Rachel forces herself to look him in the face, where his eyes once were. What remains of the pilot's jaw moves, and another scream rings out in her mind. He reaches for her with an arm that's almost complete, and she flinches, then responds. She half expects her fingers to pass through him, but instead there's a jolt like an electric shock. For a timeless moment, she becomes him. Rachel relives Michael's life not in sequence, but in chaotic fragments, images from childhood, adolescence, and his time in the Luftwaffe, jumbled in shifting kaleidoscopic patterns. But from hundreds of faces, one reappears again and again, an idealized image lit with the gold and green of a perfect summer remembered. It's of a smiling blonde-haired woman bending down, holding out her arms to her little boy running to her. Closer, closer, but then just before she can enfold him, she vanishes. He opens a formal letter of condolence, looks up through his tears to see the silent faces of his friends in the barracks. Ashamed to be seen crying, he's unable to stop. They killed my mother, the English terror flyers. Grief, rage and confusion almost overwhelm her. The scream is welling up inside her, and she can't tell if it's her voice or his. Perhaps it doesn't matter now. I wanted to kill May, make them suffer, bring terror to their nights, rain death from the skies, and leave all their children weeping. Oh, God, forgive me. How can I face her after what I have done? Rachel feels the turmoil in the mind of a boy forced to become a man too soon. To the very end, he couldn't reconcile what he knew of the war, of his own deeds and those of others like him, with the unselfish love he cherished above his country or his service. She almost loses her grip on his hand, feels what remains of his flesh falling away, bones grow brittle and give. Rachel clutches him more tightly, tries to pull him close. Go to her, Michael. She's not ashamed of you. She knows you were angry, that you did your best, and were brave to the end. Go to her in the high places, far above the night fighters, beyond the bomber's moon. She's waiting for you, Michael. The scream grows louder. The silver river twists below, and then she can see nothing but the warehouse hurtling up to punch her body into ground meat. Rachel comes around to the taste of whiskey. Reverend Black is holding a flask to her mouth while Tony supports her head. She hears her mumbling and makes out Father O'Connor holding up a rosary and praying over her. She coughs up a mouthful of scotch, raises herself on her elbows. "Thanks. Good to know you've all got my back, sort of." "You went down like the proverbial sack of spanners," says Tony, concern clear through his attempt at humour. "Is he gone?" asks Black. "I sure hope so," she replies. "I don't want to go through that again." Not for the moment, anyhow, she thinks. But I know I can do it. Doncaster wasn't a one-off. If I can help them, the lost souls, do I have the right to simply pass by? It's a clear autumn evening in London, and a full moon is rising. A month after Rachel's intervention, the warehouse in the East End has not caused Father O'Connor any more concern. Rachel undoes her hair, let it fall around her shoulders, and puts her arms around Tony. "How long before you have to be back at headquarters?" she asks. "A couple of hours, tops," he replies. "I had to do a lot of grovelling to get tomorrow off, so I'd better be good tonight." "Not too good, I hope, soldier." Things are well under way when someone knocks at the door and a cheerful voice says, "Hey, lovebirds, untangle yourselves for a minute and let me in before I collapse." Rachel tries to suppress giggles as Tony hops across the room, one leg in his pants. She shouts, "Just a minute, Charlotte." "I happen to know you can get up to a lot of mischief in a minute," replies her friend. "Okay, come in," Rachel says, opening the door, after checking that she and Tony are more or less fully clothed. Charlotte enters the small apartment like a tall, blonde force of nature, and gives the red-faced Tony a knowing glance before depositing half a dozen parcels on the table. "There, I think that's the lot," she says to Rachel. "I get the feeling I'm witnessing a black market transaction," Tony says. "Well, don't look," replies Charlotte. "In fact, you shouldn't be here at all. Everybody knows it's bad luck." "We're not superstitious," says Rachel, unwrapping the biggest parcel. "Turn your back at least, Tony," shouts Charlotte, gesturing with her cigarette. He turns and picks up his jacket from the bed, starts to put it on. Meanwhile, Rachel unfolds a white dress and holds it up to herself. "Not bad," says Charlotte. "It's about the right length for you. Tiny." "We can't all be Valkyries," Rachel says, walking to the mirror. In the dim light, the dress looks old-fashioned, austere. Rationing of cloth has taken its toll on fashion. "No peeking, Tony. You definitely can't see the dress the night before." Charlotte positions herself between her friends. "You do realize that my home is a one-person apartment, strictly speaking," says Tony. Try the veil, says Charlotte, ignoring him. Rachel puts on the simple veil, then holds up the dress again. She's right, it isn't bad, she thinks. But am I doing the right thing? "Tell me when I can turn round, girls, please," says Tony. Charlotte takes the dress and veil and packs them up again before grabbing another parcel. "Right, I've got 2 pairs of shoes. These, I think, are a bit of a long shot, but give them a go." Tony emits a moan of frustration and Charlotte pats him on the shoulder. "You can watch this bit if you like. I know how fascinated you chaps are by all the subtle gradations of ladies' footwear." "Oh, God, please make it stop," he moans. Rachel goes up to her fiancé, takes his face between her hands. "Honey, remember this. All the stuff I put on tomorrow morning, you get to take off tomorrow night." "My sentiments exactly," says Charlotte. "Check the other shoes." "Right you are, Miss Marsh," says Rachel. "Will we definitely see you at the registry office tomorrow, 9:30, sharp?" "I wouldn't miss this for the world, darling," replies Charlotte. "Why you have to get hitched at such an uncivilized hour beats me." "We'll adjourn to the pub as soon as possible," promises Rachel, trying on shoes. "These make me look like my crazy Aunt Frida. She has about 12 cats." "Okay, the first pair it is then. Feeling nervous, Tony?" she asks. "Got those night before jitters?" "Not until you mentioned them," he replies. "Thanks." "Ah, the things we do for love," says Charlotte, pinching his cheek before starting to parcel up the unwanted shoes. "Sometimes I think the world would be better off without it." "Maybe," says Rachel. "Well, I guess we're stuck with it for now." After Charlotte leaves, they look out at the street, wave at their friend, watch her hail a cab and disappear into the great warren of London's streets. There are plenty of people on the sidewalk, and they play an old game, giving silly backstories to individuals that strike them as interesting. Rachel points to a young woman crossing the street towards Tony's building and starts to make up a life for her, then realizes that Tony can't see her. The young woman looks up at Rachel, who sighs. "I just gotta go out for a minute, honey. I'll be back soon. Promise."